There is a particular geometry to a river crossing that most people never think about, because most people have never had to. You arrive at the bank. You need to reach the other side. There is one way across, and one man who provides it, and that man is the ferryman. You do not choose the ferryman. You do not negotiate the ferryman. You get on the boat and you are alone with him, and the river is on every side of you, and you have paid your fare, and you are going to the other side. In Lawrence County, Kentucky, on the Big Sandy River, that geometry was Ezra Dill's operating model for at least 11 years. He was 61 years old in 1897 when the investigation that ended his tenure on the Big Sandy finally produced what the investigators had been looking for, not in the river, which had been searched twice, but in a section of bottomland behind his property that the searches had not previously reached. What they found there was the accumulated physical evidence of a practice that had been operating at the Lawrence County crossing since at least 1886, and possibly since Dill had first taken over the ferry franchise from its previous operator in 1883. The official count established at the inquest of 1897 was 7 confirmed. The unofficial assessment, shared in private correspondence between the Lawrence County judge and the state attorney general's office in Frankfort, was considerably higher than that. The correspondence is in the Kentucky State Archives. It has never been referenced in any published account of Ezra Dill's case. Before we begin, drop your location in the comments and tell me what time it is where you are. The Big Sandy River runs fast and cold at that crossing even in summer. I want to know where you are sitting when you hear this. Lawrence County, Kentucky in the 1880s and 1890s occupied a position at the meeting of 3 states, Kentucky, West Virginia, and Ohio, converge in that corner of the Big Sandy Valley, that made the river crossings there not simply local conveniences, but genuine commercial arteries. The Big Sandy at Louisa, the county seat, carried traffic between eastern Kentucky and the Ohio River system. Merchants, laborers, surveyors for the coal and timber companies, men traveling on legal business, men traveling on business, they preferred not to discuss at the county courthouse. All of them crossed the Big Sandy at various points along the Lawrence County stretch, and all of them, if they used the Dill crossing, encountered Ezra Dill. The crossing itself was located 3 miles downstream from Louisa, at a point where the river narrowed between limestone bluffs on the Kentucky side and a wide gravel bar on the West Virginia side. It was not the main crossing. There was a more established ferry operation at Louisa itself, but it served the road that ran up the eastern fork of the Big Sandy Valley, and it was used with enough regularity to sustain a ferryman's livelihood, though the traffic was thin enough that most days Dill would have had a long stretch between crossings. That interval between crossings was the key feature of his operation. Thin traffic meant long periods alone at the landing. Long periods alone meant that a traveler who arrived at the Dill crossing and then did not arrive at their destination on the other side of the river had a large window of uncertainty around when, exactly, the failure had occurred and what had caused it. The river was fast. Men fell from ferry boats. Men's horses shied at the wrong moment. Men who were traveling alone and were not expected at any particular place at any particular time could be reported missing days or weeks after the fact, with no reliable accounting of where they had last been seen. Ezra Dill had chosen his location and his franchise with the precision of a man who understood the geometry of the crossing better than his customers ever would. He was a large man, broad and slow-moving, with a build that suggested strength held in reserve rather than strength in use, and with the patience that belongs to men who spend their working lives waiting for the next customer to appear on the far bank. His face was described in the sworn testimony of multiple witnesses as pleasant in a quality that was difficult to pin down precisely, not friendly exactly, not warm, but agreeable, the face of a man who had cultivated the expression of harmlessness as a professional skill. His eyes were described as dark brown, steady, giving nothing back. He had been at the crossing long enough, by the late 1880s, that travelers on that road expected him there the way they expected the river itself, as a fixed feature of the landscape, the man who had always been at that landing and presumably always would be. The physical description of Ezra Dill that appears in witness testimony is worth dwelling on. because it illustrates the particular kind of self-presentation that made his operation sustainable for over a decade. He was not a man who projected threat. He projected its opposite, the easy, unhurried competence of a man who had been doing the same job in the same place for a long time and had arrived at a complete comfort with it. The witnesses who described him in the trial proceedings all used variations of the same word: pleasant, a pleasant man, a man with a pleasant manner, not warm, not charming, not memorable in any striking sense, just the baseline of agreeableness that a service provider on a lonely road needs to present in order to keep customers coming back. He had perfected the expression of harmlessness over 15 years of professional practice, and he had perfected it so completely that the 4 investigators who spoke with him in the years before his arrest all left the Dill crossing having assessed him as a man with nothing particular to hide. The first suggestion that something was wrong at the Dill crossing appeared not in any official record, but in the personal letters of a merchant named Calvin Fry, who operated a dry goods business in Catlettsburg and who maintained correspondence with a network of traveling buyers and agents throughout the Big Sandy Valley. 3 of those buyers had used the Dill crossing in the period between 1886 and 1892 and had subsequently failed to return from their trips or to make contact with Fry's business. Fry had attributed each disappearance separately to the ordinary hazards of road travel in eastern Kentucky. It was only in 1892 when a 4th buyer, a man named Henry Alcott, failed to return from a trip that should have brought him back within a week that Fry sat down with his correspondents and looked at the 4 cases together and understood that he was looking at a pattern. Fry brought this to the Lawrence County Sheriff in the spring of 1893. The sheriff, a man named Hollis Rowe, noted the report and conducted an inquiry that was, by the evidence of what followed, insufficient. He visited the Dill crossing. He spoke with Ezra Dill, who recalled all 4 of the missing men with the same fluent ease that characterized every subsequent account of his interactions with investigators, remembered them clearly, recalled them crossing without incident, had no explanation for what had happened to them afterward. Rowe recorded the visit, noted no evidence of wrongdoing, and closed the inquiry. Fry's letter to Rowe after this outcome, preserved in the Calvin Fry papers at the Catlettsburg Public Library, reads in its entirety, "You have made a mistake. I do not know yet how large a mistake. I am writing this down so that when the full size of it becomes clear, there is a record of when I told you." It took 4 more years. In 1897, a man named George Tatum, a timber surveyor from Ironton, Ohio, traveled the East Fork Road on company business, crossed at the Dill crossing in the afternoon of October 8th, and was expected in Williamson, West Virginia, by the following evening. When Tatum had not arrived or made contact by October 12th, his employer sent a messenger to retrace the route. The messenger, a man named Silas Branch, crossed at the Dill crossing on October 13th, spoke with Ezra Dill, received the same account Dill always gave: man crossed without incident, headed south, couldn't say what became of him after that, and then, instead of continuing to Williamson, turned around and rode to Louisa and presented himself to the circuit court judge with a written account of what he had found and what he had not found, and a copy of Calvin Fry's original 1893 letter, which Tatum's employer had obtained from Fry, specifically because Fry had been telling anyone in the Big Sandy commercial community who would listen for 4 years that the Dill crossing was not safe. The circuit court judge authorized a full investigation. He assigned it to a deputy named Ambrose Keene, who had the specific quality of persistence that the situation required, a man who, once given a task, did not stop until the task was finished, and who was, by multiple accounts, the least comfortable person in Lawrence County to have looking at your property. Keene's investigation lasted 3 weeks. He began with the river itself, organizing 2 separate searches of the most likely sections of the Big Sandy downstream from the crossing for the remains of recent victims. Both searches found material, but none that could be positively identified at that stage. Keene then turned his attention to the Dill property, the house, the outbuildings, the landing itself, and spent 4 days conducting a physical survey of every structure and every section of the ground he could access. The bottomland behind the property was low and dense with second-growth vegetation, and it was on the 3rd day of the ground survey, in a section of that bottomland approximately 200 yards behind the main outbuilding, that Keene's team found the first physical evidence that was not ambiguous. The official record of what was found is in the Lawrence County Circuit Court file dated October 31, 1897, and it describes the discovery in the careful, measured language of a legal document. It identifies a location of disturbed earth approximately 30 feet long by 10 feet wide, covered in vegetation that had been established for varying lengths of time over different sections of the area, indicating that the disturbance had occurred at multiple separate times over an extended period rather than in a single event. It notes the recovery of items of personal property, tools, clothing, personal effects, consistent with travelers rather than residents, and it notes the physical evidence that the district physician, called to the scene from Louisa, assessed as consistent with the remains of a minimum of 7 individuals at various stages of decomposition. 7 confirmed. That was the official count. The private correspondence between the circuit court judge and the state attorney general's office in Frankfort tells a different story. A letter from the judge to the attorney general, dated November 12, 1897, describes a second survey of the bottomland conducted by Keene after the official inquest had been submitted. It describes the survey's findings with a specificity that the official record does not contain. The letter concludes with a line that the judge underlined. The official count is a conservative accounting, prepared with the welfare of the community and the manageability of the proceedings in mind. The full accounting, if it were made public, would be considerably more disturbing and would serve no purpose that the administration of justice in this case requires. Ezra Dill was arrested on November 1, 1897. He maintained the same composure in arrest, in custody, in examination, and at trial that he had maintained throughout his entire career at the crossing. Pleasant, patient, giving nothing back. He did not confess. He offered no explanation for what had been found on his property. He said, when asked directly at trial whether he had killed the men whose remains had been identified, that he had not, and that he had no knowledge of how those remains came to be on his land. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. He was convicted of murder and sentenced to death. He was hanged at the Lawrence County Jail in Louisa on March 4, 1898, at 62 years old. He made no final statement. The account in the Louisa newspaper the following day described him as going to the gallows with the same expression he had worn throughout the proceedings: pleasant, patient, entirely unreadable. The circuit court judge who presided over Dill's trial made a notation in his personal diary, a diary preserved in the Lawrence County Historical Society archives in Louisa, on the evening after the verdict. He wrote, "The evidence was sufficient, and the outcome was correct. What remains with me is not the verdict, but the man. I have sentenced men before who were frightened or remorseful or angry. I have sentenced men who were defiant and men who were resigned. I have not before sentenced a man who seemed, throughout the entire proceeding, to regard what was happening as a matter that was simply running its expected course. He had no surprise at any point. He had no visible response to the verdict. He went back to his cell with the same expression he had worn coming into the room. If there is something inside a man that corresponds to conscience, I did not see evidence of it in Ezra Dill. What I saw was a man who had made a calculation long ago and had been executing it ever since, and who understood when the execution finally ended that this, too, was part of the calculation he had made." The Dill crossing was closed by county order in 1898, the franchise revoked and not reissued. The ferry apparatus was removed. The road that ran down to the landing from the East Fork route was eventually closed and grown over and is not passable today. The bottomland behind the property was surveyed one final time by a county representative in 1899, and the report of that survey, the last official examination of the site, is in the Lawrence County Courthouse archives in Louisa. The final line of the report reads, "The survey found conditions consistent with the prior examination. No new disturbance was noted. The surveyor recommends no further action and the permanent closure of the site to public access." The permanent closure has held for 125 years. The site is on private land today. It is not marked. It is worth noting what happened to Calvin Fry's letter, the one he wrote to Sheriff Rowe in the spring of 1893, the one that said 4 of his buyers had gone missing on the route passing the Dill crossing, the one that Rowe had noted and set aside. After Dill's arrest and conviction, Fry made a formal request for the return of that letter. He wanted it back, he said in a note to the court clerk, because he wanted to know that it existed somewhere other than a sheriff's file that had already done nothing with it once. The court clerk returned the letter. Fry kept it until his death in 1911. His daughter donated his business papers to the Catlettsburg Public Library, letter included, in 1928. The letter sat there for over 90 years before a researcher working on the history of river commerce in eastern Kentucky found it in 2019 and understood what it was. The researcher published a short account of the Dill case in a regional history journal in 2021, the first published account of the case in any academic venue. It is 3 pages long. It is cited in no subsequent publication. The crossing is still closed. The bottomland is still unmarked. Here's the question that Ezra Dill leaves behind, and it is not about the law, which handled him as well as the law handles anything. The question is about the geometry. He chose a crossing rather than a fixed location. He chose a crossing on a secondary road rather than the primary crossing at Louisa, because the secondary road meant thinner traffic and longer intervals between customers and longer intervals between a man's last confirmed sighting and the point when anyone began to wonder where he was. He chose a crossing at a point in the river where the current ran fast and the water was deep, because fast water is a plausible explanation for a man's disappearance and a difficult place to search. He maintained a pleasant, patient, agreeable manner for at least 15 years because a ferryman who seemed dangerous would have driven business away, and Ezra Dill never drove business away. He did not do any of this quickly or impulsively. He did it continuously and systematically for a minimum of 11 documented years. The question is, when did it start? Not the first time he killed someone, though that is also a question the record does not answer. The question is, when he first understood that the crossing was useful, not just as a livelihood, but as something else. Was that understanding there from the beginning? Did he seek the ferry franchise precisely because he understood what it offered him? Or did the understanding arrive later as the geography and the isolation and the intervals between customers made certain possibilities visible to him over time? Is Ezra Dill a man who built a trap, or a man the trap built? Drop your answer in the comments. I want to know which one you find more disturbing. If these histories from the crossings and the landings and the places where travelers passed alone are the reason you found this channel, subscribe and ring the bell. Not every road that was closed for ordinary reasons. There is a note in Deputy Keene's investigation file that I want to put on record, because it does not appear in any account of the case and because it is the closest thing to a human moment in an investigation that is otherwise relentlessly procedural. On the last day of his ground survey of the Dill property, after the evidence in the bottomland had been documented and the district physician had been called, Keene wrote in his field notes, "I spoke briefly with the ferryman's nearest neighbor, a farmer named Alton Webb who lives approximately a mile upstream. Webb has lived on that stretch of the Big Sandy for 30 years. I asked him whether he had ever seen anything at the Dill landing that concerned him. He was quiet for a long time before answering. He said, 'I have noticed things.' I told myself they had explanations. I did not go looking for the explanations. I am not sure I would do differently if I had it to do over, because the explanations I told myself were easier to live with than the explanations I was afraid were true. I have written this down because it is the only honest thing anyone has said to me in 3 weeks of investigation. The Big Sandy River still runs fast at that crossing. It has been running fast there for a very long time. The water does not remember what it carried. The bottomland does not forget. And the bottomland behind the old Dill property is still there, unmarked, on a piece of land that has changed ownership several times in the last 125 years. The people who have owned it since 1898 have, as far as the record shows, no knowledge of its history. They bought land on the Big Sandy that had once had a small farming operation on it and had since grown up in second-growth timber and brush. They did not buy a history. The history came with the land, whether they knew about it or not, the way history always does. The marking, or the absence of marking, was a decision made in 1899 by a county representative who wrote in his final survey report that no further action was recommended and that the site should be permanently closed to public access. That decision has held. The land does not know it made a decision. The river does not know it was complicit. Only the record knows, and the record is in Louisa, in the Lawrence County Courthouse archives, in a file that has been sitting there since 1897,